A very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us today. For those of you not familiar with Anveshan, Anveshan is a forum of researchers, academicians, journalists, and activists who share a commitment to the idea that human society needs to and can undergo a progressive social transformation that will eliminate all forms of oppression and exploitation. We've been active for many years, and in the past, we've organized many panel discussions, talks, and conferences on a range of social, political, and economic issues. And ever since the lockdown has been declared, we've organized a lot of talks online, which you can find on our YouTube channel. And if in case you want to find out more about Anveshan, you can write to us. I'll just post the email ID in the chat box. So we have with us two speakers today, and as you all know that under neoliberalism, agriculture in the third world and specifically in India has witnessed an increasing number of farmer suicides and displacement, and this has to do with the pressure of the market forces and also the policies of the government. And in India, it becomes all the more alarming because a majority of the workforce continues to be employed in agriculture. So and we've witnessed an increasing precarity in the last couple of years in agriculture. And recently, the Indian government has passed 3 bills which have rendered the farmer more vulnerable to the pressures of the market and other agents. So, and consequently, we've also seen a number of countrywide protests by farmers. So, we're here to talk about the 3 bills which have recently been passed against the larger backdrop of agriculture and food security under neoliberalism. So, we have with us 2 speakers today. We have with us Professor Utsa Patnaik, who is a Professor Emerita, Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And we also have with us Dr. Sanjay Madhav, who is the Joint Secretary of All India Kisan Sabha, Rajasthan. So without much delay, I'll invite Professor Utsa Patnaik.
I think I'm audible to you and visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. So, you are all aware of the fact that the recent bills which have been passed practically by force in Parliament have meant a substantial deregulation of agricultural markets. They are going to allow now private players into agriculture to purchase not only commercial crops but also food grains and outside the mandis or regulated markets. And it is quite right for the farmers to be extremely worried about this. What I would like to do today is not talk to you directly about the bills per se. I would like to try to situate what is happening today within a much longer and broader context, particularly an international context of attempts which have been going on for more than a quarter century now to bring the agriculture of developing countries, including India, into a completely free market framework and to, as it were, go back in an economic sense to the kind of division of labor in primary production that we had during the colonial period. Now, what is the reason for this? And why do I say it has been going on for more than a quarter century? Well, it all really started with the inclusion of agriculture and the formulation of the agreement on agriculture, the setting up of the World Trade Organization in 1994, to which India also became a signatory, without really understanding that the agreement on agriculture was an extremely unfair and one-sided document. I'll come to the why it was unfair and one-sided a little while later. But let me first explain why it was necessary for the advanced countries, because it is they who took the initiative in bringing agriculture within a general agreement on trade, because agriculture had never before been brought under the purview of multilateral trade agreements. This was the first time in the early 90s that it was done. The reason is that Um, when the colonial period ended, and during the period of decolonization, a number of developing countries, including India, had broken loose from the colonial division of labor, under which they had been forced to orient their cropping pattern and their resources towards satisfying the needs of the metropolitan countries. And this had had a very adverse effect on the food security of their own populations. Because even though the lands of these developing countries the lands are much more productive than the lands of today's advanced countries. You know, tropical lands can produce at least 2 and up to 3 crops in the year, compared to a single crop in the cold temperate lands where all the advanced capitalist countries are located. So these countries can only produce 1 crop in the year, only in their summer months. In the winter months, they cannot even produce what they produce in their summer months. And of course, they can never produce in any season tropical crops at all. So as I have extensively argued, and in our joint book with my spouse, The Theory of Imperialism, we have put forward this idea that people have not really looked at this material reality and its economic impact, because this was one of the major reasons for today's advanced countries coming all the way halfway across the world to colonize our countries. Because countries like India and China, especially, which were very large, very biodiverse, really did not want to trade voluntarily with European or North American countries. They had everything they wanted. So the use of force and forced trade was resorted to, as you know. Now, the reasons for advanced countries wanting to access the lands of developing countries has not gone away with decolonization. Because no matter how much technological change you have under advanced capitalism, one thing they cannot change is their climate. They still, of course, cannot produce tropical crops at all. And moreover, they also cannot produce their own crops, which they produce in summer, in their winter months. So there's a very high degree of seasonality. So there has been an incentive for many decades now for the advanced countries to try to gain access all over again to the lands of today's developing countries as they had in the colonial past. But of course, they cannot get access in the old form because they no longer have political control. So the access they try to get is in new forms, which are suited to the present era. They have been constantly badgering developing countries to remove all their protective measures and to open up to free trade once more. And they have been constantly badgering the developing countries to say that their own governments should not engage in procuring food grains, but should go to the global market. Why are they saying this? Why have they been saying this for such a long time? The reason is that, you know, if you look at the data, you'll see that Europe, the European Union, USA and Canada together, even though they have only 10.5% of global population as of 2017-18, they produce more than 30% of global cereal output. And the populations of their countries are absolutely satiated with cereals. They consume directly something between 100 to 120 kilograms per capita per annum of cereals. That is in the form of bread, etc. And they convert anything between 400 to 600 kilograms, using it as feed grains, to animal products, to dairy products, poultry, meat, and so on. With the result that today, the United States actually consumes something like more than 600 kilograms per capita of grain in direct form as well as in indirect form converted to animal products by using the grain as feed, compared to, for example, India, which only has about 165 kilograms use of cereals in direct and indirect form. Now, the populations of these advanced countries simply cannot consume any more cereals, even in the form of dairy products, meat, and so on. What they really want and have wanted for a very long time is access to fresh produce in their winter months, fresh vegetables, fruits, and so on. And of course, to coffee, tea, and so on, that cannot be produced in their own lands at all. And this has historically always been the case. And their consumption basket has been diversifying as their incomes have been rising. And this diversification has also been aided by the fact that from the 1970s onwards, there was a very sharp drop in the cost of air freighting produce from distant lands to North America and to Europe. Now, before the 1970s, all produce went by ship. Air freighting was very expensive. But this changed roughly from about 50 years ago. In my own childhood, I remember that when I had traveled to England, because my father was posted in England by the government, he was a government servant for 3 years when I was about 8 years old. It was so expensive to travel by air that we actually went by ship. This was in the mid-50s. And even the return journey was made by ship, not by air. So air travel for passenger as well as freight started in a big way only from the 1970s onwards. And that has rendered developing countries very vulnerable, because now it is not only the traditional export crops, which we were forced to export in the colonial period at the expense of decline in our own food production. It is not only these crops which are now being exported. The advanced countries demand from us perishable products, from which we were protected. This kind of export we were protected from earlier by the fact that it took 3 weeks even going through the Suez Canal by ship. But now, in a matter of 15 hours to 16 hours, fresh fish produce from Bangladesh or India or even from China can be flown to Chicago and New York and San Francisco, not to mention countries in Western Europe, to American cities in a matter of 15 hours. So there's been, since the 1970s, an enormous development of agribusiness, of the growth of agribusiness corporations in the advanced countries, which have come into the developing countries, which want to source fresh produce from them. And flowers is also another thing. They can't grow any flowers in winter, but you will find people presenting each other with roses in December and January, which they source from developing countries. So it's not just food, it's also all kinds of luxury products. And what they want is a division of labor in which tropical countries, which are biodiverse, which have multi-cropping, which are much more productive than ours, divert more and more of their land and resources to filling up supermarket shelves, especially in winter, with the produce they cannot produce themselves. And they say that, look, we have a surplus of food grains. So why do you want to produce food grains at all? You should source your food requirements from the global market. That is the redefinition of food security, with the result, of course, that a lot of progressive movements have said that we don't want food security, we want food sovereignty. Food security, in the sense that the IMF, World Bank, North America defines it, is not good enough. We can't rely on the global market. We have to have food sovereignty in our countries. We have to have the freedom to be able to decide our own cropping pattern in such a manner that we continue to produce enough basic staple food grains for our own population. And why are food grains so important? Because food grains are a cheap source of both energy and protein. And the populations of developing countries like ours cannot afford expensive animal proteins. Even to this day, 2/3 of total daily energy intake measured in kilocalories per day, and more than 2/3 of daily protein intake in India comes from the cereals alone, not even counting pulses. Cereals plus pulses of the food grains. So even if we just take the cereals, and a few years ago, 15 years ago, 2005, something like 3/4 of the average energy intake of the average Indian came from cereals alone. More than 3/4 of protein intake came from cereals alone. So cereals plus pulses, of course, which make up food grains, are very important for our populations. And the proportion is even higher in many other least developed countries. So we cannot afford a situation where we again have a colonial type division of labor in primary products, where we produce to satisfy the needs of very rich advanced country populations. Of course, advanced countries also have a poor segment in their population. But when we look at the average income of the North American or the European, West European, or the Japanese compared to the average income of the Indian, the Bangladeshi, the Sub-Saharan African, then we see that the average income abroad is in nominal terms 40 to 60 times higher. And even in purchasing power parity adjustment terms, it is anything from 20 to 40 times higher. So we cannot afford to let this superior purchasing power draw away our products to alter the cropping pattern of our lands. And this is something that I've been talking about for 25 years. But the advanced countries find the fact that our governments operate procurement and public distribution system, particularly in food grains, they find this a hindrance to their aims. And they want us to give it up completely. This attack started a long time ago. It started in the early 1990s itself, when there was tremendous pressure on a lot of developing countries. And these developing countries actually succumbed. There were dozens of smaller developing countries and not so small ones like the Philippines, which used to have public procurement and distribution of food grains. And they were forced to give this up. There was so much pressure on them to rely on the global market. Philippines gave it up. I remember I went for a conference to Philippines in 1997. They had given it up 3 years earlier. And that particular year or the year before that, there had been a phenomenal drop in rice output because of floods. And so they had to buy at a very high cost from the global market. And there were riots in the Philippines in 1996, 97. Similarly, right up to the early years of the century, country after country were forced to give it up. And even in India, there was a tremendous attack on our food procurement and distribution system, saying that it is inefficient, you privatize it, the government should not be wasting time procuring food and distributing and so on. All this led to actually between 2001 and 2007, the procurement price for food grains, the minimum support price for food grains in this country remained practically stagnant. There was hardly a 10 to 15% rise, even though costs were going up. And as a result, our food grains production also started to plateau, started to become virtually stagnant in the bread bowl of the country, in Punjab, Haryana, and so on. And the per capita food grains output started dropping very steeply. It was only the global food crisis of 2008. It started at the end of 2007. Then prices shot up during 2008. It trebled and quadrupled. And immediately you had riots in 37 countries in the world, which had been made to become dependent on the global market earlier. And that was the point at which our policy changed. So after 2008, again, the food procurement and distribution system underwent a revival. So it has been a seesaw kind of thing. But now again, for the last few years, there's a renewed attempt by the advanced countries to get the bigger countries like us, like India, to give up our food procurement and distribution this is a several pronged attack. One part of the attack is, of course, to say that you have to liberalize your agriculture even more. You have not liberalized enough, even though there's been an enormous degree of liberalization since 1997 over the past more than 2 decades. Quantitative restrictions have been given up. Our tariff levels have been lowered very, very substantially. There's been a huge degree of opening up to global trade in India, but they're not satisfied with that. They say that your public procurement and distribution system is violating WTO agreement on agriculture. I will come to the details of what their argument is in a moment. It is a completely dishonest argument, but they're hammering away at it for years and years now, saying that, you're violating WTO agreement on agriculture. You have to reduce the subsidy you give to your farmers. Actually, the subsidy that we give in the form of market price support is negative. There is no positive support at all if you calculate the support correctly and scientifically. But the advanced countries, the US and the EU, use dishonest methods of calculation to say that you're giving huge subsidies. I'll give you some of the figures in a moment. So this is an ongoing attack which has been going on. And the present farm bills have to be seen in this context. They have to be seen in the context of the fact that agribusiness corporations abroad want to come into our agriculture in the same way that they have succeeded in going into Latin American countries, into Southeast Asian countries, into sub-Saharan African countries. They want even greater freedom, and they think that their freedom is going to be restricted as long as there are regulated markets, because they want the market to be, in their words, completely free. And of course, they put forward all kinds of dishonest and fallacious arguments saying the Indian farmers are going to benefit, etc. The ultimate objective is that we should start importing from them, and we should export more and more of the products they cannot produce. We should change our cropping patterns even more than we have already, because we have already had a shift in our cropping pattern over the last 20 years, but we should specialize even more, like we did in the colonial period, or were forced to do in the colonial period, in satisfying the non-grain requirements of the advanced countries of the goods they cannot produce at all, or they cannot produce in the winter months. You look at the amount of surplus food grains they have. The problem is that agriculture, there is a problem that they have, that agriculture is not the same as any other sphere of production. If the American consumer or the European German consumer does not want to buy any more shoes, then the producer of shoes can diversify into some other manufactured product. But if the American consumer, the European Union consumer does not want to consume any more grain in direct or indirect form, the farmers are not able to diversify because they cannot produce sugarcane, they cannot produce spices, they cannot produce tea and coffee, they cannot produce anything at all in their winter for the consumers. So that is why they want us to absorb their mountains of surplus food grains, and for that they want us to give up our systems of domestic food procurement. Now that's a very dangerous thing for anybody to do, as the global food crisis demonstrated clearly. Had we given up our food procurement and distribution systems, we would have been completely dependent on the global market. Our internal prices would have shot up. There would have been starvation in our cities if we had become import dependent to that extent, as indeed there was in 37 developing countries which saw food riots at that time. Okay. Now, let me quickly go on. I think I've already spoken for about 20 minutes. Maybe I have another 5 or 10 minutes more.
Yes, ma'am.
So I will quickly go on to some concrete data on how in very recent times, a couple of years ago as well as at the moment, the USA and in particular has been complaining to the World Trade Organization. It has had submitted a memorandum 2 years ago. I've written on this, but I don't think most of you would have seen this article that was published 2 years ago. This is a communication from the United States of America dated 9th of May 2018 to the WTO under a particular clause of the Agreement of Agriculture, saying, giving some calculations and saying that India gives price support, which is not allowed, to the extent of 77% of the value of its rice production, and it gives price support to the extent of 65% of the value of its wheat production. It has given calculations for 3 years, starting from 2013-14, or maybe ending in 2013-14. I don't recollect the exact dates, but I've got the data for 2013-14 here. And there is a de minimis clause in the agreement on agriculture, which applies to developing countries, saying that they can give price support up to a value of 10% of the value of their production. The USA is claiming that we are giving 77% in the case of rice and more than 65% in the case of wheat. Now, how are they arriving at these figures? Now, even though it's a little technical, I think I shall go through it because it will give you an idea how completely dishonest and full of tricks the advanced countries are. They were dishonest and full of tricks even when the agreement on agriculture was formulated. But our economists did not realize it then. They were not familiar with what was going on in terms of subsidies. India had been a protected economy, the primary sector, for like 1950 to 1990, 1990s. That's 40 years. Why was the agreement on agriculture itself a form of trickery? Because it said that certain forms of subsidy did not need to be reduced, and these were direct cash transfers to farmers. They were not subject to any reduction commitment. So advanced countries can easily give direct tax transfers to their farmers. United States has only 2 million farmers. Those 2 million farmers contribute now less than 4% to the GDP. And if you give direct cash transfers, as the USA has been giving, in some years to the extent of 50% of the value of their total agricultural output, this is a very small proportion of their total budget, okay? I don't know the exact proportion, it varies, but it's definitely less than 5% of their total budget. And it amounts to a huge subsidy to the extent of 40 to 50% of their entire value of produce. They have continued doing that because in the agreement on agriculture, they have put all direct support measures in what they have called a green box. We did not say it was a green box. We did not say, we were not consulted about whether it was going to be subject to reduction commitments. They wrote the rules. The only form of subsidy that developing countries like ours can ever give to their farmers is price support. We cannot give direct transfers, particularly the large countries like India. We have in excess of 100 million farmers, at least 120 million. Even if you leave out the people who have only small bits of homestead land on which they grow vegetables, you say, okay, we leave that out. Even then, we have up to 12 crore farmers compared to 2 million alone in the United States. How are you going to give cash transfers and how can your budget sustain it? Because even though the contribution of our agriculture to our GDP has been dropping over time because farmers have been underpaid, it is giving half of the value of our agricultural output as subsidy, as the United States does, would mean giving 80% of the central budget as farm subsidy, which is absolutely impossible. Even giving 5 to 6% of the central budget as subsidy is not feasible, given the huge numbers of farmers we have. So price support is the only thing that we can actually give. So they are attacking price support because they say that you are violating agreement on agriculture. And how are they attacking us in this particular memorandum that they've submitted recently to the World Trade Organization? Their calculation is the following. In fact, they have written the rules of the agreement in such a manner that they take the external reference price as the price. Let me take, for example, wheat. The external reference price of wheat, they take the average for the years 1986 to 88, which is now more than 30 years in the past, if I'm correct, right? So that external reference price of wheat multiplied by the exchange rate of the rupees for dollar at that time, which was 12.5 rupees to the dollar, gives you 354 rupees as the price per quintal of wheat, which they take as the reference price. And if the Indian government gives more than that to the farmer today, 30 years later, they say you're violating the agreement. Now, the reference price in 2013-14, external reference, according to this calculation, was 354 rupees. And the actual price which the government was giving, the minimum support price for wheat, was 1,386. Obviously, because if they continued to give the price that was prevalent at that time, you know, in 1986 to 88, then that would have been a trivial sum. It would have been a very tiny sum. And prices have risen more than tenfold since then. So what the US now does is it subtracts from the actual minimum price, MSP, which is 1,386 for wheat, this artificially calculated price of 354 rupees, and it says that you are giving support to the extent of 1,032 rupees per quintal. 1,032 rupees. Then, in order to calculate the total support, you have to multiply by the output which is receiving support. And for this, they take the entire output of wheat, not the output entering the market, but the total output, which in that year was 93.5 million tons. So they will multiply 93.5 million tons by this 1,000, more than 1,000 rupees. Take it as 1,000, do the calculation yourself. What will you get as the measure of support? You will get a measure of 1 lakh crore rupees that they've calculated as the subsidy that is going to the Indian farmer. And they say that this amounts to 2/3 almost of the total value of wheat production in the country. Look at the dishonesty of this. You are taking a price which prevailed more than 30 years ago. You're not making any allowance for the fact that the domestic costs of production have risen. You are yourself giving subsidies to your own farmers to an enormous extent, unbelievable extent. And you have exempted all those subsidies from reduction commitments. Whatever reduction commitments you had in North America and Europe was satisfied within 2 years of their signing within 1996 itself, because it was so small, it was trivial. They reduced it at that time. And at the same time, you're making these dishonest calculations to say that we are subsidizing our farmers to the extent of 66% of the value of wheat production. They do a similar calculation for rice, and they say that you're subsidizing your rice production to the extent of 77% of the value of your rice output. Now, the thing is that I think it is very essential for intellectuals to engage themselves in this dishonesty which is going on. Because, you know, our farmers are busy farming. The people who actually work are busy working. So the only people who have the leisure to do these calculations and to reveal the fraud which is going on are the intellectuals, and we, after all, live on the surplus, the economic surplus that our farmers and our workers produce. So it is our duty to do this. Now, so far, the Indian government has not agreed to this kind of a calculation, and it has repeatedly pointed out that you cannot take this reference period, which is more than 30 years back in the past. You have to take account of present day costs and so on. And if we take account of the present day, of the rate of exchange of 2013-14, which actually prevailed, which was 60.5 rupees to the dollar, and we take account of the actual minimum support price which was being given, which, as I've told you, for wheat was on average 1,386 rupees, then we find that India gave negative subsidy. The subsidy that it was given, what the farmers were getting as at MSP, was actually less than the border price of wheat, properly and scientifically calculated. Okay. Now, just day before yesterday, again, the US has gone at us again. It has again sent a set of questions to India, saying, can you explain why you have 114 million tons of rice, but you are saying that only 44 million tons are eligible for subsidy, for market price support? What about the remaining 70 million tons? Now, either the people asking these questions from the US government are extremely foolish and ignorant, or they are extremely clever and devious, because you cannot assume for a developing country that the system of production is like that of an advanced capitalist country. In the United States, if a person produces, if a rich farmer produces wheat, he does not consume anything out of his output. All of it is put on the market for sale. He will go with his family to the nearest supermarket and he will buy his bread and flour and other requirements like any other consumer from the supermarket. There is no question of any enterprise in the US which produces cereals actually keeping anything for their own use. Okay, so these are large business corporations. Now the case is completely different in countries like India and in other developing countries, where such a large proportion of our farmers are small farmers, and even the rich farmers will keep a certain proportion of their own output for their own consumption. They will keep something of their own output for seed for the next season. They will keep the byproducts of grain production, the husk and straw and so on, for feeding their animals. And this has been the thing going on for centuries, and it still continues. So if we say 44 million tons of milled rice is eligible for support in India and gets a little bit of support, price support, we are right, because we are taking the marketed surplus of rice at 2/5 of the total production, at 40% of the total production. And that is a correct figure. But what the Americans do when they're attacking us in WTO is they take the entire rice output as eligible for support, and therefore they produce these inflated figures. Now, I went into some detail here because I want our farmers and leaders of the Kisan Sabhas and so on to understand that these people, the reason why we are facing this kind of an attack on our food procurement and distribution system now for decades on, we have been resisting this attack, sometimes succumbing to a certain extent, as during 2001 to 2007, then pulling back from the brink and reviving our public distribution system. But now again comes a period of succumbing, because giving up regulated markets, allowing corporations, which will also include foreign corporations, agribusiness corporations, to actually access the produce of our farmers directly, to enter into contract with them for supply of produce, and do so outside regulated markets. This is a very dangerous thing, as the farmers realize very well, and that is why they are demonstrating, and that is absolutely correct. But how dangerous it is, I think not everybody realizes, because the ultimate aim is to dislodge the PDS from our country completely, not just dislodge minimum support prices for farmers, but also the issue of necessary food grains to our poor consumers in urban areas who are dependent on their BPL ration cards to access affordable food, to dislodge that entire system completely. That is the ultimate objective, which has been already realized very successfully in a number of smaller developing countries. So this is really a very, very important fight. The implications are very far-reaching, much further reaching than has been discussed in the literature so far. And I would be very happy now to stop, because I've been going on for much longer than I should have. And to answer, I can only afford to take 2 or 3 questions, because unfortunately, I had invited some people home and I have to leave the meeting by 7 o'clock. Thank you.
Right. So ma'am, okay. So it'd be best, I think, if we take a couple of questions before inviting the next speaker.
I'm stopping the video so that it goes on at least for another 10, 15 minutes. But I think you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can. Yeah. So there's a question from Sakib. He's asking about if only the developed world or also the Indian agro business is trying to create a space in the Indian agricultural market and get bills like these passed in the name of reforms. And then there's a question, a related question. Do you think some sort of massive procurement by cooperatives by respective states could be an alternative? And
yeah, okay,
yeah,
I'll take 3 questions and answer them serially.
All right, and then there's also a request from Deepak if you can just circulate the paper in which you were talking about the calculations and support to farmers. Yeah, so
yes, so let me answer these 3 first.
right.
The first, sorry,
Can we take one more question? There's a related question.
Okay.
Yeah, so Atri is asking if so Europe has currently redirected decoupled payments with coupled payments supposedly linked to environmental protection measures to conform to green box measures. This is the way developed countries are playing us, and this is the way they keep protecting their farmers. So I think it's more of a comment.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
All right, let me very quickly go through the questions. The first one was on our own corporations. Yes, of course. Our own corporations are quite globalized. So when I talk about global, I include the domestic as well, because they also have some global operations, many of them, not all of them, of course. And they would like to be global players as well. In fact, some Indian corporations are going into Africa as well, as you're aware. But anyway, let me not enter into that. But the point is that our population itself, you see, we have to remember, in terms of purchasing power, is highly segmented.
Our question?
Sorry? Yes?
No, I think there was some interruption. Carry on, ma'am.
Okay, I'm muting. I'm going on the video as well in case people find it easier to lip read. Where was I? Yeah, our population is a highly segmented one in terms of purchasing power. Now, I would say that the top 5% of our population really has advanced country living standards. And they would like to have advanced country lifestyles as well, and they do have. The lowest 75 to 80% have abysmally low living standards. Okay? And 15% are somewhere in between, which we can really call the middle class. So certainly you will have domestic agribusiness coming in. Firms which are already there, like Reliance and so on, have already started sourcing from the farmers in order to supply their supermarket-style shops where the well-heeled go to shop. But the reason I was stressing the advanced country corporations is that danger is actually much greater. Because in the case of our domestic corporations, at least you're satisfying your domestic elite. But in the case of the advanced country corporations, your agricultural production is going to supply a global elite, which, as I've said in terms of purchasing power, is enormously powerful, and which can therefore restructure your cropping pattern, and that is your land use and your output pattern completely away from what your own population needs towards what they need. That is what they did during the colonial period, which we had such a dire situation. We had the data, which I keep quoting, for the 50 years before independence, went from 200 kilograms per capita grain availability. Availability is when you adjust output for trade, that is net imports, the output plus net imports. So around 200 kilograms per capita availability per annum around 1900. By 1946, it had fallen to 137 kilograms per capita. And that is a more than average 600 kilocalories decline in energy intake per day. So you ended up with starvation. And of course, with the Bengal famine, actual starvation deaths of 3 million, which however was caused not by the longer term trends, but by trends specific to war financing during that period, which I've also written about in my paper on the Bengal famine. But the point is that when you look at historical evidence, which I've done in my book, The Republic of Hunger, not only for India, but for other countries which were colonized. For example, Korea, which was colonized by Japan, Java, which was colonized by the Netherlands, you find exactly the same pattern. That is, the land use and output mix in agriculture changes towards the exports, which are the imports into the developing country, which they want from us. And this is at the expense of declining basic food availability for our own population, in many cases leading to famine. But certainly an overall trend decline, an overall decline in the nutritional standard. And exactly the same thing we find happening once we open up to free trade from the early 1990s, and I have documented this in my book, The Republic of Hunger, up to roughly about 2006, because that book came out in 2007. And the situation after the 2008 global price crisis has improved slightly, but we are still far below in terms of our per capita grain availability. In India, we are far below the level we were in at the beginning of the reform period in the early 1990s. Our per capita grain availability for all users, not just food, but animal feed, processing, all kinds of industrial use, wastage, seed, take everything. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization data in 2011 was 176 kilos. We were below the average for the least developed countries, which was 212 kilos. We were below the average for the whole of Africa. They had 225 kilos. We were far below China, which was around 320 kilos. We were far, far below, of course, Europe, which is around 600 kilos. And the US, of course, the use was more than 1 ton, more than 1,000 kilograms compared to our 176. So we are already in a pathetic situation. Now, if you have further liberalization and you have, the foreign agribusiness corporations coming in and having free play in unregulated markets and through contract farming, the position is going to become even more serious than it is today. You will have even more hunger and you will actually have starvation as well. We don't realize it because everything said and done, all the people belonging to the class I belong to and who are listening to this do not belong to the bottom 80% of the population. So we are not aware of the abysmal level of living from which they suffer, including declining nutritional standards. So so that is my answer to the first question. It became longer than I expected. So that is why I see the global threat as 10 times more serious. The domestic threat is there, but it's 10 times more serious if you include the global corporation. Massive procurement by cooperatives. But why should cooperatives procure? In the sense that, what was the basic idea behind the setting up of a Food Corporation of India? Setting up of a procurement and distribution system run by the central government. As I've said in one of my papers, it was the economic expression of the political unity of the Indian people. So it's not simply just a technical matter. This is what I call, this is not a normal nation that we live in. It's a super nation. I call it a super nation. Because every other nation in the world, is one language, one country. Or it is one language, several countries, like in Latin America. You have Spanish, several countries speaking that language, or you have, in Canada, you have at most 2 languages, one country. China, 90% of the people, even though they have minorities, they write one language. They have the same script. They may pronounce it differently, but 90% have the same language. Now, this is a country where you have at least 18 major languages with their own scripts, their own literature. You have minorities which are very large minorities of the population. This is not a country in the European and American sense. It's a unique formation. It is a super country. And only a federal structure is suitable for it. Now, why should, in a federal structure, food procurement and distribution be centralized in the hands of a central government? Because even though it is a federal structure, you have specialization in different parts of the country. Kerala, for centuries, has been food deficit. Why? Because for centuries, it has specialized in export crops, which the whole world wanted. Not only pepper, but later on coffee, tea, the spices, other spices other than pepper, and so on. Similarly, Assam has its tea, Karnataka has its tea and coffee production. West Bengal, the northern part of Bengal, has its tea production. So when you have areas where land is specialized into already as a historical reality in producing export crops, and you have therefore food grain deficiency. And you have other parts of the country which have been particularly suited to adopting green revolution technology in the 1960s and 70s, and which have therefore emerged as it were the grain bowl of the country, which enormous surplus production of not only wheat, but rice also started to be grown as a commercial crop in Punjab. So you have enormous surpluses of grain in Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh. That is the grain bowl of our country. So it is the responsibility of a central government to ensure that no part of the country goes hungry because it is specializing in export crops. After all, the foreign exchange which is earned from Kerala's export does not go to the government of Kerala. The foreign exchange goes to the Reserve Bank of India. It is a central pool, okay? It is not an individual state pool. So it is the responsibility of the central government to ensure that grain is transported the 2,000 odd miles or even more from northern India to Kerala to ensure that there is no shortage there. That is, the food surplus states have to provide their surpluses to the food deficit areas. This is mandatory for any government which claims to run the entire country and which does not simply claim to run the area, the national capital region, all right? And that can only be done if there is a food subsidy. Subsidy is not going to farmers for their production. Subsidy is going to meet the cost of storage and transport from the grain surplus areas to the grain deficit areas. This is something people don't understand. And this is something we also have to hammer into the heads of all the people, all those teams from North America and European Union who are attacking us in the WTO, that our food grain subsidy is not going to the farmers per se. It is basically going to ensure an equitable distribution of food grain availability across a very vast country, which is regionally specialized in terms of the cropping pattern, okay? So there is no question. This is another area in which the attack has been on, where the central government has periodically said it is a state government responsibility. Oh, is that so? In that case, the central government should give the state governments to keep its own foreign exchange for itself. It should not centralize the foreign exchange into central coffers. If it's the central government's responsibility to provide food if it's the state government's responsibility to provide food to its poor population, then the central government should not take the goods and services tax, which is a centralized taxation system. It should go back to a federal taxation system. And you can see what havoc has been caused by GST now, because the state governments have to deal with the fallout, both of demonetization, the rising unemployment, food insecurity, falling incomes, but they don't have the funds to do so because it's all been centralized since the last 2 years. Okay, the third question is about my paper. Sure, I can give the paper to the organizers. If they like, they can send it to whoever is interested.
Sure, ma'am. I'll do that. Yes, I think you'll have to leave now.
Yeah, thank you very
Yeah.
much for
Yes,
your
and
patience in listening to me.
on behalf of Anveshan, I'd like to thank you for taking out time for the talk.
I'm very
Despite
sorry.
the,
I must apologize profusely for my discourtesy in not attending the second speaker's speech. But if you're going to be putting it on YouTube, I will have the opportunity of listening to it later on.
Absolutely, ma'am. I'll share the link with you.
Sure.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you
ma'am.
very
Thank you
much.
so much for taking out time for this.
Thank you.